Officer Carter's mistake. Officer Jake Carter had been patrolling the streets of a small Texas town for years. The days were long, the work monotonous, and the heat during the summer months was unbearable. But on this particular afternoon, as he sat lazily in his patrol car, sipping cold coffee, everything seemed like it was going to be just another uneventful shift. He had seen it all before: no accidents, no violations, just the oppressive silence of a small town simmering under the midday sun. But then, the sudden beep of his radar broke the calm. A black SUV, speeding at 72 miles per hour in a 55 miles per hour zone, appeared on the screen. At first, it seemed like just another routine stop. Carter, with his usual cool indifference, flicked on his siren, confident that this would be a quick ticket to write, and another boring day behind him. He had no idea that this moment would spiral into a life-changing event. The SUV pulled over easily enough, and Carter, almost on autopilot, approached the vehicle. He was ready for the usual exchange license, registration, a few defensive excuses, and then he'd be back on his way. His tone was mechanical, and he barely looked at the driver, a man who appeared impeccably composed, as he handed over his documents. The name on the ID stopped him in his tracks. General Michael Hayes. Carter read the name aloud, disbelief creeping into his voice. It was a name he recognized from the news. Hayes was a war hero, a leader of men who had earned respect on the global stage. But Carter, in that moment, chose to disregard the significance of the name. His mind was already racing, filled with a mix of judgment and entitlement that he could no longer control. He had seen men like Hayes before: wealthy, influential, and seemingly untouchable. In Carter's eyes, they were often above reproach, their status shielding them from the consequences the rest of society had to face. And it was precisely this assumption that clouded his judgment. Carter's anger, which had been simmering under the surface for years, began to bubble up. It was an anger born of personal frustration with his own life, with his struggles, with the way he had been forced to navigate a world that always seemed to favor people like General Hayes. His bias, whether he was fully conscious of it or not, began to drive his actions. In that moment, he didn't see Hayes as a human being. He didn't see a decorated hero. He saw someone who, in his mind, thought he could break the rules and get away with it. The calmness Hayes exhibited only seemed to fuel Carter's growing resentment. "You know you broke the law?" Carter asked, his voice sharp. Hayes, ever the picture of composure, responded simply, "I was speeding." But that wasn't enough for Carter. His mind raced, and his decision to escalate the situation became inevitable. Hayes's calm demeanor, in Carter's eyes, was a sign of arrogance. Why wasn't Hayes reacting like everyone else? Why wasn't he apologizing, offering excuses, trying to explain himself? Why did he look like he was above this? It was then that Carter's bias completely overshadowed any sense of professionalism he had left. With a snap of his fingers, Carter ordered Hayes to place his hands on the car, his voice rising in authority. Hayes complied, but the growing tension was palpable. Carter's anger and frustration overpowered the rational part of his brain. His mind was set on making Hayes suffer, even if it meant violating the very principles of justice he had sworn to uphold. The small part of him that had once wanted to serve and protect seemed to disappear, replaced by something darker: an impulse to dominate, to put this man in his place. Carter reached for Hayes's arm, twisting it behind his back, and that's when something unexpected happened. Hayes, with surprising calm, didn't resist. He looked Carter directly in the eyes, his gaze unwavering, and said, "If you think you can intimidate me just because I'm black, you are deeply mistaken." The words hung in the air, heavier than Carter could have ever imagined. Hayes wasn't just a man of power or influence. He was a man who knew his rights, and in that moment, he wasn't afraid to challenge Carter's authority. Officer Carter, who had spent his life believing in the power of his uniform, suddenly realized how far he had gone. His need to assert control, to punish someone he believed was above the law, had clouded his judgment to the point where he had violated the very oath he had taken. It was a mistake born of deep-seated prejudice and an inability to see people for who they truly were. Instead, Carter saw General Hayes as a symbol of everything he resented, everything he thought was out of his reach. And in that moment, Carter learned the harsh truth. His mistake wasn't just a violation of law, but a betrayal of the very values he had sworn to protect. What started as a routine traffic stop had escalated into an event that would haunt Carter for the rest of his life. His actions would have far-reaching consequences, not just for his career, but for his understanding of power, justice, and the biases that lived within him. In that one moment, Officer Carter had revealed the dangerous truth about unchecked anger, prejudice, and the consequences of failing to see people for who they truly are. Hayes' calmness. General Michael Hayes stood still, unwavering, as Officer Carter's words cut through the thick tension that surrounded them. His demeanor remained calm, his posture poised, as he faced the officer's escalating aggression. He had dealt with far worse situations in his life, far more intense moments of danger and stress, yet none had quite matched the inner turmoil of being mistreated by someone who should have been there to protect him. But as the officer's hand reached for his arm, Hayes felt no anger, no frustration. His response was measured, deliberate, as he took a deep breath, choosing not to let the officer's hostility dictate his actions. In that moment, Hayes knew that his calmness was more than just a personal trait. It was a quiet form of resistance. He had seen this before people like Officer Carter, who had no idea what it was like to walk through life with the weight of an identity that was judged by appearance alone. He had witnessed it countless times in his military career, but it never got easier to bear. The assumption that he was somehow different or less deserving of respect because of the color of his skin was an invisible burden he had learned to carry. But he had also learned over the years that it was the quiet strength, the ability to remain unshaken, that often disarmed those who tried to diminish him. Hayes understood that in this moment, his response was not just about avoiding an unnecessary confrontation, it was about holding his ground, making it clear that he would not let anyone strip him of his dignity. His words to Carter were measured, not out of fear or submission, but out of a deep understanding of the power of self-control. "If you think you can intimidate me just because I'm black, you are deeply mistaken," he said, his voice calm and steady. The weight of those words lingered in the air, and as he said them, Hayes made sure to meet the officer's gaze. He wanted Carter to see in his eyes that this wasn't a man who would shrink away under pressure, no matter how much the officer tried to provoke him. Hayes wasn't just any man. He was General Michael Hayes, a man who had fought on foreign soil, commanded troops, and sacrificed so much in his service to the country. But in this moment, none of that mattered to Officer Carter. Carter, in his blind rush to assert control, had forgotten one crucial thing. Hayes was not just a victim of this situation. He was a man who understood power, responsibility, and the value of keeping calm under fire. As Hayes spoke, his mind wasn't on the humiliation of the moment. It wasn't on the injustice of being treated as a criminal when he had done nothing wrong. His focus remained on something deeper. He knew that the real battle here wasn't with the officer, but with the system that allowed officers like Carter to act in such a way. His calmness, in essence, was a form of self-preservation, but it was also an act of defiance. In the face of the officer's aggression, Hayes chose not to match anger with anger. He chose to stand his ground, knowing that the true strength lay not in physical force, but in maintaining control over one's own actions and emotions. Carter's attempt to dominate him physically and emotionally fell flat in the face of Hayes's calm resilience. The officer may have been in control of the situation in terms of power, but it was Hayes who commanded the room with his dignity, his poise, and his unwavering sense of self. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. It was a moment of reckoning, a chance for Hayes to show not only Carter, but everyone watching, that no one, no matter how much authority they held, had the right to strip away his humanity. As Hayes stood there, facing the officer with a quiet confidence, he realized that his calmness was more than just personal fortitude. It was a message to everyone who had ever been unjustly targeted or belittled because of their race or background. In a world that too often allowed injustice to go unchecked, his calmness was a powerful reminder that dignity could not be taken by force, it could only be given away. Hayes knew in that moment that while he had every right to react with anger or resentment, his calmness spoke volumes more than anything else ever could. The officer was the one who was losing control, not him. This quiet strength was not just a reaction to the officer's behavior. It was the embodiment of a lifetime spent navigating a world that didn't always see him for who he was. It was a lifetime spent fighting battlesome on foreign soil, others within his own country, where he had to prove his worth over and over again. And as he stood there, composed, unyielding, he realized that his true power lay not in what he could do to others, but in what he could refuse to let others do to him. His calmness was his rebellion. His stillness was his resistance. And in that silence, he had already won. Escalation and public witness. The moment that had started as a routine traffic stop began to unravel rapidly, escalating into something much more significant. Officer Carter's decision to disregard the calm demeanor of General Michael Hayes was not just a simple act of insubordination. It was a reflection of a deeper, more troubling mindset that had been allowed to fester unchecked for far too long. The tension in the air thickened as Carter's actions became more aggressive, and Hayes' resolve to remain calm and composed stood in stark contrast to the officer's growing frustration. It was no longer just about speeding or a simple citation. It was about power, control, and the way certain individuals felt entitled to impose their will without regard for the law or for human decency. As Carter's hand reached for Hayes' arm, twisting it behind his back, it became clear that the officer wasn't just trying to enforce the law, was trying to assert his dominance. It wasn't a professional reaction. It wasn't a rational response. It was a reflection of Carter's unchecked prejudice, a dangerous and toxic belief that people like Hayes were lesser, that they could be treated differently because of their skin color. And it wasn't just the officer's actions that began to escalate. The entire situation had started to spiral out of control. Hayes' ability to remain calm and composed in the face of unwarranted aggression was remarkable. But what was even more important was the shift in the dynamics of the situation. His poise was no longer just about self-control. It was becoming a beacon for what was right, a quiet stand against injustice. The real turning point, however, came when the first of the onlookers began to take notice. As Carter's frustration mounted, a second officer, Lieutenant Rodriguez, pulled up on the scene. Rodriguez, unlike Carter, understood the weight of the situation. His immediate recognition of Hayes' identity, the general, who had led military operations, the decorated hero, was the first sign that something was deeply wrong with the way Carter was handling the stop. The tension that had been building up until that point reached a fever pitch as Rodriguez stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the unfolding scenario. There was no mistaking the situation now. Rodriguez could see it for what it was: an abuse of power, a moment where a public servant had let personal bias cloud his judgment and escalate a minor incident into a potential catastrophe. As the lieutenant spoke, his words rang out with a clear sense of authority. His approach was one of diplomacy, trying to defuse the situation before it could go any further. But Carter, consumed by a mixture of pride and anger, refused to back down. His stubbornness clouded his ability to see reason, and he clung to his belief that Hayes, despite his rank and reputation, was somehow beneath him in this moment. But the arrival of the public witness, Rodriguez, had already begun to change the course of events. Rodriguez's calm presence and the recognition of Hayes' status as a national hero created a shift that Carter couldn't ignore. His actions were now being observed, not just by the people directly involved, but by the public eye. And then, the situation took a further turn as the presence of a journalist, also witnessing the scene, added another layer of scrutiny. The journalist, sensing the significance of the moment, began recording. The weight of the cameras was not lost on Carter. Suddenly, it wasn't just about him and Hayes. It wasn't even just about the badge he wore or the power he thought he had. The public eye was now on him, and his every move would be examined and scrutinized. It wasn't just Hayes' life and reputation on the line anymore, it was Carter's too. The presence of the media changed everything. It put a spotlight on Carter's actions, revealing to the world the true nature of the situation. In that moment, As the cameras rolled and Rodriguez recorded everything, Carter's bravado began to falter. He could no longer rely on his position of authority to control the situation. The moment he grabbed Hayes and attempted to use physical force, he failed to realize that Hayes' calmness wasn't weakness, it was strength. The public witness, the media, and the other officers around him, all combined, created a pressure that was beginning to force him to confront the reality of his actions. It was no longer about the confrontation between an officer and a civilian. It had evolved into a moment of societal reckoning, a chance for those who had the privilege to observe, to reflect, and perhaps act. The escalation of this incident, from a routine traffic stop to a public spectacle, was not just a result of Carter's personal failure. It was a reflection of a deeper societal issue, one that had been allowed to fester in silence for far too long. The moment the public became involved, the stakes were raised exponentially. And as the cameras continued to roll, it became clear that this wasn't just about the two men standing on that street corner anymore. This was about the system, about the abuse of power, about the way certain individuals were treated differently because of their race, their status, and their position in society. It was no longer an isolated incident. It had become a public event that could no longer be ignored. Public backlash. The storm that followed Officer Carter's actions wasn't just a momentary flash of outrage, it was the beginning of a reckoning. Once the footage of the incident involving General Michael Hayes was released to the public, it spread like wildfire. It wasn't just a clip of police aggression. It was the face of an officer who had overstepped his bounds, disregarded the law, and acted on personal biases. The video went viral, reaching communities far beyond the small town where it occurred. What was supposed to be a minor infraction a speeding ticket had turned into a flashpoint for much larger conversations. The public response was swift and intense. Social media platforms buzzed with anger, disbelief, and calls for accountability. The footage quickly made its way to news outlets, with commentators dissecting the officer's every move. It didn't take long for the hashtag number Justice for General Hayes to start trending, and with it, a tidal wave of public backlash. People, regardless of their background, watched in horror as Carter's actions were exposed for what they were: an abuse of power. The racial undertones, the arrogance, the dismissal of General Hayes' authority, all boiled down to a deeper, uglier truth that had been ignored for too long. What made the backlash even more potent was the reaction of people who had never been directly affected by such incidents. They, too, were outraged. They saw a Manon who had given so much for his country being humiliated by someone who was supposed to protect and serve. And what made it worse was that Carter's actions were driven by assumptions, prejudices, and a belief that certain people could be treated unfairly without consequence. For many, it wasn't just about the officer's misconduct, it was a reminder of the systemic problems that plagued their communities. It reminded them of the ways in which power could be wielded unjustly, how the scales of justice weren't always balanced, and how people of color were disproportionately targeted by law enforcement. For some, the outrage was personal. It brought back memories of similar experiences, of moments when they, too, had been treated unfairly by those in authority. It wasn't just a police officer's mistake anymore. It was a reflection of a pattern that had long been ingrained in society. The outcry was more than just indignation, it was collective pain, frustration, and a demand for change. People from all walks of life began to speak out, sharing their own stories and amplifying the voices of those who had long been ignored. The incident became a touchstone, sparking discussions about the need for police reform, the importance of accountability, and the role of systemic racism in law enforcement. Even in the small town where the incident had occurred, the anger was palpable. Local businesses, organizations, and community leaders began to weigh in, demanding action. Some even held rallies, calling for a fair investigation and transparency in the process. The public outcry reached such a magnitude that it became impossible for the powers that be to ignore. It wasn't just the citizens of the town, it was the world watching, holding their breath, waiting to see how the authorities would handle the situation. As the days passed, the repercussions of Carter's actions became more apparent. His name was now synonymous with the very problems that the public had been calling out for years. His career, once built on the trust of the community, began to unravel. The very public trust he had sworn to protect was now in jeopardy. Colleagues who once greeted him with familiarity now avoided eye contact. The whispers behind his back grew louder. Carter's mistake had not only damaged his own reputation but had brought shame upon the department he served. The backlash didn't just affect him, it affected the entire law enforcement community, forcing them to confront the reality of how their actions were perceived by the public. In the midst of the outcry, one thing became crystal clear. The public wasn't going to let this go. The voices demanding justice were too loud to ignore, the demand for accountability too strong to silence. For General Hayes, this wasn't just about him anymore. It had become a symbol for something far greater. And for Carter, it was the beginning of a long, difficult road. He had crossed a line, and now he had to face the consequences. The public backlash wasn't just a reaction, it was the start of a larger conversation about the need for change, about justice, and about the responsibility of those in power to act with fairness and integrity. And as the calls for accountability grew louder, it became clear that this incident, as painful as it was, might just be the catalyst for the change that so many had been waiting for. Investigation and consequences. The days that followed Officer Carter's actions were filled with an overwhelming sense of uncertainty, tension, and regret. What began as a routine traffic stop had now spiraled into a full-blown scandal. With Carter at its center, the investigation that ensued was swift, but not without its toll on everyone involved. The truth had become impossible to ignore, and as the facts began to unfold, the consequences of Carter's behavior grew more apparent. The internal investigation into Carter's actions was launched immediately after the video of the incident spread like wildfire. What had once been a local concern quickly became a national issue, with public outcry demanding accountability. Officer Carter, once proud of his position, now found himself on the defensive, facing questions that forced him to confront the dark reality of his actions. The weight of the media's gaze was suffocating, and the scrutiny from his superiors only amplified the pressure he felt. He could no longer hide behind the badge he had worn so confidently. The mask he had put on for years, pretending to be a just enforcer of the law, was now slipping away, revealing his true character or lack thereof. The investigation into his conduct was thorough. Every aspect of the encounter with General Hayes was dissected. Witnesses were interviewed, including Lieutenant Rodriguez, who had tried to de-escalate the situation, and the journalist who had recorded the confrontation. The footage was examined frame by frame, revealing not only Carter's clear misuse of power, but also the calm dignity with which General Hayes had handled the situation. It was clear to anyone who watched that Hayes had done nothing wrong. He had complied with every order, even when faced with unnecessary aggression. The more the investigation delved into Carter's actions, the more evident it became that his behavior had been influenced by bias, not just against Hayes, but against anyone he deemed to be above his station. Carter's personal prejudices, his refusal to acknowledge the humanity of those he viewed as different, had led him to abuse his authority in a moment where restraint and professionalism should have prevailed. As the investigation progressed, Carter's colleagues, once allies, began to distance themselves. His behavior had cast a dark shadow over the department, and many of his peers couldn't ignore the fact that what he had done was inexcusable. Some even expressed their disappointment privately, unable to reconcile the man they had worked beside with the officer they saw in the footage. The department's reputation, one that had taken years to build, was now on the line. The higher-ups were under pressure, not just from the public, but from their own internal standards. There was no way to sweep this under the rug. Carter's actions had crossed a line, and now they had to answer for it. For Carter, the consequences of the investigation were devastating. What had once seemed like a minor mistake, a routine stop gone wrong, had turned into a career-ending scandal. The loss of his job was inevitable, but the damage to his personal life was just as profound. His friends, his family, and his community no longer saw him as the officer who served and protected. They saw him as the face of the systemic issues they had long feared and fought against. The support he had taken for granted was gone. The very foundations of his life were crumbling, and he found himself alone. with only the stark reality of his actions to face. In the weeks that followed, the public's demand for accountability reached a crescendo. People wanted more than just a reprimand or a slap on the wrist. They wanted justice. They wanted to know that Carter's actions would not go unpunished, that the system would not continue to protect those who used their power to harm others. Carter's fate was sealed when the department made its final decision. He was fired. But even that was just the beginning. His reputation, his career, and his legacy had been shattered, leaving him to reckon with the profound and irreversible damage he had caused. In the end, the investigation and its consequences were not just about punishment for a single officer. They were about a larger reckoning, a society forcing itself to confront the uncomfortable truths about the abuse of power and the systemic racism that continues to permeate law enforcement. For Officer Carter, the consequences were harsh but deserved. For General Hayes, the ordeal had become a symbol of the fight for justice. The true cost of Carter's actions was not just measured in the loss of a job, but in the opportunity to change an opportunity he had squandered in favor of pride, prejudice, and an inability to see the humanity in others. The investigation was the beginning of a much-needed conversation, one that had the power to spark change. And though Carter had fallen from grace, perhaps the greater purpose of his failure was to show the world that accountability was possible, even for those who held power. Hayes's powerful statement. The moment General Michael Hayes spoke up, everything changed. It wasn't just the words that left his mouth. It was the weight behind them, the sheer power of his presence, and the calm, unwavering dignity with which he conveyed his message. Hayes didn't react in anger, nor did he seek revenge. He didn't need to shout or demand attention. He simply stated the truth in a way that was impossible to ignore. His words were not only a defense of his own rights, but a powerful reminder of the broader fight for justice that so many had been engaged in for decades. What he said resonated far beyond the small town, carrying with it the strength of all those who had been silenced, oppressed, and underestimated. As he stood there, his calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Officer Carter's aggression. The tension in the air seemed to soften as Hayes spoke, his voice steady and deliberate. "I did nothing wrong except speeding," he began. But it was what followed that struck at the heart of the situation. "But if you think you can intimidate me just because I'm black, you are deeply mistaken." The simplicity of his statement cut through the charged atmosphere. It was a moment of quiet defiance. A man who had spent his life serving his country, now faced with the reality of being treated unfairly not because of his actions, but because of who he was. Hayes wasn't just defending himself. He was speaking for everyone who had ever been subjected to systemic racism, for those whose lives were often devalued and disrespected by the very systems meant to protect them. In those few words, Hayes encapsulated the struggles of countless others who had found themselves in situations where their dignity was called into question solely based on the color of their skin. He didn't need to explain further. His point was clear. The issue was not just about a minor speeding violation, but about the unequal treatment he had received because of ingrained biases. He was a man of principle, someone who had seen the worst of the world, yet had managed to rise above it with honor and respect. Now, he was facing an officer who seemed determined to strip him of that dignity, simply because he believed his own power could trump the rights of others. As Hayes spoke, there was no hint of defensiveness or resentment in his voice. Instead, he conveyed a quiet confidence, one that seemed to come from deep within an understanding of the larger battle he was part of, a battle that was much bigger than any single moment. This wasn't about the officer before him. It was about every individual who had been oppressed and marginalized for generations. Hayes's words weren't just a challenge to Officer Carter. They were a message to the system itself, to the broader society that had allowed these injustices to persist for far too long. It was a reminder that no one should be made to feel small or powerless because of their race. His message hit harder because of his calmness. In a world where rage often seems to be the only response to injustice, Hayes showed that there was another way. Strength through composure, power through restraint. He wasn't trying to provoke. He wasn't seeking retribution. He was merely making it clear that he would not be diminished, that his rights, his dignity, and his humanity could not be stripped away by the prejudices of others. The officer may have tried to humiliate him, but Hayes had already won. His words, steady and calm, not only exposed the officer's wrongdoing, but also illuminated the truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. As Hayes made his statement, the silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't the silence of fear, but the silence of realization. Officer Carter stood there, caught in the weight of his own actions, and in that moment, Hayes became a symbol of justice, not because of anything grand he had done, but because he chose to stand his ground. He chose to speak the truth with courage and dignity, and in doing so, he changed the course of the situation and, perhaps, the future itself. Carter's personal struggle. The weight of Officer Carter's personal struggle began to take shape in the moments after his confrontation with General Hayes. What had started as an ordinary day of routine patrol was now a moment of profound self-reflection that Carter could no longer escape. As he stood there, the tension of the situation gnawing at him, he felt something deep within him shift. He had spent his entire career upholding the law, believing in the righteousness of his role, but now, in the face of his own actions, that belief was cracking. Officer Carter had always prided himself on being a good cop, someone who served his community with a sense of duty and pride. But what had happened that day made him question everything. It wasn't just about the law anymore, it was about his biases, the subconscious prejudices that he had carried with him for years. Only now they had been exposed. It wasn't just a case of misconduct. It was a reflection of a deeper issue, something inside him that he had either failed to recognize or had chosen to ignore. For the first time in his life, Carter felt the uncomfortable sting of shame. His initial reaction to the situation with General Hayes had been driven by something primal. It was an instinctive power grab, an attempt to assert control in a moment when he felt threatened, though not by the general, but by his own insecurities. He was rattled by Hayes's calmness, his unwavering confidence, and it made Carter feel small in comparison. He had been so sure of himself in the beginning, so certain that his badge and his authority would keep him in control. But Hayes had shattered that illusion with a few quiet words, exposing the inner conflict Carter had long buried under the surface. As the investigation into his actions unfolded, Carter's personal struggle intensified. It was no longer just about the consequences he might face, though those were significant enough: suspension, the loss of his job, the public backlash. It was about the internal reckoning that had begun to unravel everything he had believed about himself. Carter had always considered himself above reproach. He had been taught that the law was the law, and that those who enforced it were unquestionably in the right. But now he was forced to confront the reality that his actions weren't just a mistake. They were a reflection of systemic issues that had allowed him to view certain people through a lens of bias and entitlement. This struggle wasn't just about the career he might lose. It was about the person he had been and the person he feared he might become. Carter had spent his life building a reputation as someone who could be trusted, someone who upheld justice, and now that reputation was crumbling. He had underestimated the power of his own prejudice, the way it had seeped into his decisions and clouded his judgment. And even worse, he had not recognized the harm he was causing. The personal cost of his mistake was far more profound than the professional consequences he was facing. It was the realization that he had betrayed the very principles he had vowed to uphold. It was the crushing weight of knowing that, in a moment of frustration, he had let his own anger and fear dictate his actions instead of the calm and reason he had been trained to embody. And worst of all, it was the realization that he had, however unknowingly, participated in a system that dehumanized others, those who were different from him simply because of the color of their skin. As the days wore on, Carter found himself wrestling with guilt, confusion, and self-loathing. His career, his identity, and his beliefs all felt like fragile things, ready to shatter at any moment. And in the quiet moments when no one was watching, when he was alone with his thoughts, he couldn't escape the image of General Hayes's calm, measured response, his words ringing in Carter's ears. "If you think you can intimidate me just because I'm black, you are deeply mistaken." Those words haunted him, but they also made him reflect on the deeper, uncomfortable truths about himself. The fight within him wasn't just about facing the consequences of his actions. It was about confronting the prejudices he had allowed to define his view of the world. Consequences and reflection. The consequences of Officer Carter's actions were inevitable, but what truly cut deep was the way they forced him to confront not just the immediate fallout, but the man he had become. The suspension, the investigation, the loss of his badge thieves were all tangible and immediate. Yet it was the reflection in the quiet aftermath, the hours spent alone with his thoughts, that revealed the true weight of his mistake. Carter's life was unraveling, not simply because of the mistake he had made that day on the roadside with General Hayes, but because of everything that had led to it, and everything that would follow. At first, the consequences felt like a rush of quick events, public backlash, the sting of disgrace, and the overwhelming sense of shame that followed him wherever he went. His career was in jeopardy, and he could feel the shift in how his colleagues saw him. What had once been an air of respect had turned into whispers and sideways glances, the very same gestures that were once directed at those whom he had judged. Carter knew that everything he had worked for was slipping through his fingers, and yet it was not the threat of losing his job that made him question himself the most. It was the deeper realization that the person he had prided himself on being had been an illusion. The reflection came slowly, but it was relentless. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw a man who had allowed his own prejudices to shape his actions. He had let anger, frustration, and a deep-seated bias cloud his judgment. In his mind, he had been the one in control, the officer doing his job, but in reality, he had been driven by fear, insecurity, and a misguided sense of power. The truth was becoming harder to ignore. The man who had been so sure of himself was now forced to face the fact that he had been complicit in a system of oppression. It was a slow, painful process of self-realization. Carter began to recognize the bias that had festered in his mind, unchallenged, for years. He thought of General Hayes's calm and unwavering stance during the encounter, and it hit him like a wave. Hayes had not reacted the way Carter had expected. Hayes had not crumbled under the weight of Carter's authority. Instead, he had stood firm, with dignity and respect, and in doing so, had revealed the true nature of Carter's actions. The general's refusal to back down was a stark mirror, reflecting not only the immediate abuse of power, but the larger, more insidious issues that ran deep within Carter himself. As the days dragged on, Carter felt the full scope of his actions. It wasn't just about the public scandal or the career he had jeopardized. It wasn't even about the professional consequences that were now out of his control. What hurt more was the loss of his own sense of self. The man who had once believed in justice, in fairness, now had to face the uncomfortable truth that he had, in that moment, betrayed everything he had once stood for. His pride, his sense of authority, and his belief in the system had blinded him. And now, the consequences were not only legal, but personal. The shame he felt was not just about his actions on the side of the road, but about the erosion of the identity he had built over years of service. The officer he had once been seemed to fade away, replaced by a stranger who had lost his way. In the solitude of his reflection, Carter had to confront something far more significant than any external punishment: the internal battle with himself. He had been given a chance to see his own flaws, and in that painful moment, he realized that he could either resist and become a man defined by his mistakes, or he could learn, evolve, and attempt to rectify what he had done. The question was no longer about defending his actions or blaming others. It was about how he would move forward and whether he could make amends, not just with General Hayes, but with himself. The consequences were severe, but they held within them the possibility for growth. Whether he would embrace that potential for change was up to him. Call for accountability and change. The call for accountability and change echoed not just through the corridors of law enforcement, but within the very heart of the community itself. Officer Carter's mistake with General Hayes was not just an isolated incident. was a representation of the deep-seated issues that permeated the justice system, issues that many had quietly accepted as part of the status quo. The incident became a catalyst, a moment that could no longer be ignored. It was a turning point, a collective realization that true justice cannot be achieved without an unwavering commitment to accountability, both on an individual level and within the institutions we trust to protect us. As the public backlash grew, it was clear that the consequences for Officer Carter's actions were only the beginning. People were no longer content to simply sit back and passively witness the abuse of power. They were demanding change. The silence of complacency was broken by voices that had long been overshadowed, those who had suffered under the weight of systemic racism and injustice. General Hayes's calm but powerful statement resonated deeply with the community. This was not just about one officer's mistake, but about a system that allowed such behavior to persist without consequence. It was about the larger patterns of inequality that had been ingrained into the fabric of law enforcement, patterns that no longer could be swept under the rug. What made this moment so significant was the realization that accountability was not just about punishing those who acted out of line, it was about acknowledging the root causes of these actions. It was about confronting the uncomfortable truth that many officers, like Carter, had been operating within a system that failed to challenge their biases, a system that gave them power without requiring introspection or growth. The real change couldn't just come from disciplinary actions or short-term consequences. The real change had to begin from within the system itself. Police training, policies, and practices needed to be re-evaluated, not just to prevent mistakes like Carter's, but to dismantle the underlying prejudices that allowed them to happen in the first place. The public's demand for accountability was not just a demand for punishment, it was a demand for transformation. People were no longer asking for individual justice. They were calling for systemic justice. They wanted to see real change that went beyond the immediate response to this one incident. It was a call for an overhaul of how law enforcement interacted with marginalized communities, a demand for transparency, and a plea for an end to the culture of impunity that allowed officers to act without consequence. This was no longer about one man's failure, it was about the collective failure of a system that too often had failed the very people it was meant to serve. Officer Carter's actions had ignited something much larger than just his personal downfall. It had sparked a movement that was already gaining traction before the incident and was now pushing for greater reforms. Communities were rallying together, demanding that law enforcement be held to higher standards. This wasn't just about one officer being accountable for his actions. This was about ensuring that the system itself was held accountable. It was about creating a future where no one, no matter their race, felt the way General Hayes had felt that day. It was about ensuring that no one would ever again face the kind of humiliation and discrimination that Hayes experienced at the hands of a law enforcement officer who had failed to see him as a person, but as a symbol of everything wrong with the system. And as Carter sat with the weight of his actions, the conversation about change began to grow louder. It wasn't just about his personal responsibility, it was about the collective responsibility to ensure that such an incident would never happen again. The call for accountability wasn't just for Carter, but for all those who wore the badge, and for the institutions that empowered them. It was a challenge for law enforcement to not only hold its officers accountable, but to hold itself accountable to the very ideals of justice, fairness, and equality that it was built upon. This moment was a reckoning, one that would resonate long after the dust settled. The question now wasn't just how the system would punish Officer Carter. It was how the system would change, so that no other officer would ever be allowed to act with the same reckless disregard for human dignity. In the aftermath of the incident between Officer Carter and General Hayes, the truth became undeniable. What started as a routine traffic stop quickly spiraled into a moment of deep reflection for everyone involved, revealing not only the personal flaws of one officer, but also the systemic issues within law enforcement. Officer Carter's bias, fueled by anger and a sense of entitlement, led him to abuse his power, making a critical error that set off a chain of events no one could ignore. While Carter's actions were publicly scrutinized, they opened up a much larger conversation about accountability. justice, and reform. General Hayes, calm and composed in the face of adversity, became a symbol of strength and resilience, challenging the status quo and forcing everyone to question the systems that allow such injustice to thrive. As the investigation unfolded, Carter was confronted with the harsh reality of his own prejudice, and the profound consequences of his actions became clear, both professionally and personally. The lesson from this story is powerful. Personal actions, fueled by unchecked bias, can have far-reaching consequences. It's a reminder that accountability is not just about external consequences, but also about self-reflection and growth. We are all capable of mistakes, but the true test lies in how we respond to them. It is crucial to recognize when we have fallen short, to confront our biases, and to use those moments as opportunities for personal transformation. In today's world, we must actively challenge our assumptions, question the systems we are part of, and hold ourselves and others accountable for creating a more just and equitable society. This story teaches us that true progress begins with individual responsibility. Facing our mistakes head-on, we pave the way for meaningful change.